Since I arrived at this church, ooh, this is loud. Um, since I arrived at this church, I've been really amazed at the long history that's been here at this church. More often than not, churches don't last as long as churches like this. At most churches will last 2, maybe 3 generations, and I think at times that's even being generous. Just the longevity of some churches don't always come about. What tends to happen in old churches is that it will be founded by a group of people who are really passionate about the gospel, and that they draw people into a church off from that mission, and that kind of first generation of a church is really healthy, and they really understand, they're really passionate, and they make the church their own, and they let the gospel drive them, and it pushes them on that mission. However, even the most successful churches really struggle to pass on that passion to the next generation. What happens in churches is that the next generation ends up growing up in the church and the gospel becomes normalized. That passion there, that radical, life-altering reality isn't really there all the time for the second generation because it's simply what they do. They go to church, these things become assumed for them, and it just becomes normalized in many of those senses. And I think there's a goodness to that sometimes the second generation doesn't have to figure out all the things that the first generation had, but it just is different for them. They don't have to experience and go through the same things that first generation people in churches have to do. But then the real thing comes about whenever we get to like a third generation in a church, where the third generation often starts to question the assumptions of the second generation and just wonder why we do things a certain way. Is this really important to be doing this? And so a lot of those assumptions start to be questioned. And I think that's often where the gospel gets lost in churches, and that's where churches start drifting away further and further. But it's also a time of revitalization. If this new generation comes up in churches and they truly believe the gospel, they become passionate about it, the church can continue to thrive. And I think I've been hearing that testimony in our church for going on for generations and generations, for now at least. And so over the past few weeks, I've really been diving into the history here at Wilson FBC, and I've just been really fascinated by the story of it. This church was founded in 1833 by a man named Russell Robinson. And he simply just wanted to start a prayer meeting in town with the 2 other churches that were here at the time, the Methodists and the Presbyterians. I'm not really sure why he wanted to make this prayer meeting happen, why this man didn't just attend one of these other churches, but nevertheless, he really wanted this prayer meeting to happen, and those churches wanted nothing to do with him. And so as he was wanting to make this happen, he ended up convincing a couple by the name of Stephen and Anise Millard to finally join him for a prayer meeting. And the Millards are people who ended up reaching out to a man named Harvey Pettit. And Harvey Pettit ended up being the first convert of our church here. And then as time went on, they reached out to a church in Newfane, and that church in Newfane supported kind of a Baptist church being founded in Wilson. And what I think is really fascinating is that, as you can probably imagine, the name Pettit is everywhere around us here. Our church is on Pettit Street. The name Pettit is all over these windows and maybe even the pews. And I'm just amazed by that long legacy. And I was even told recently that it's just been within the last 10 years that we have not had a Pettit attending this church. And I think that's so marvelous that a family with a legacy like that lasted so long here. And I think that just shows the beauty of the longevity in a church, and just kind of seeing that a church can continue on and things being passed on to the further and further generations. And so my prayer for us as a church is that we that I just pray that God continues to show us that grace, that he gives us the ability to pass the gospel on and the passion to the next generation, and that they're able to make the gospel their own and just really to own it for themselves, and so that they can remain and this church keeps thriving. And that is what it means for a church to be salt and light in this world. And so I think I wanted to say that just as we're diving into our passage this morning and we think about what does it mean to be salt and light in this world. So let's read now Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. As we saw last week, beginning in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is teaching his followers about a right understanding of God's law. Jesus is teaching as the greater Moses on the mountain. And that framework sets the whole tone for the Sermon on the Mount for us. Jesus is teaching us about God's law and how to thrive in the kingdom of heaven. And we discussed last week one of the main purposes of the law is to shape God's people in order for them to prosper in his land. The way the Old Testament law was used is that if the people obey God's law, they will be blessed in the land. And the main point last week was that the Old Testament law falls short because God's blessing for us is no longer conditional. Jesus in the Beatitudes shows us that the blessed ones are the lowly. The blessed ones are the exiles. But this week, I want to kind of focus on the second way that the Old Testament law falls short. It falls short because its scope is too small. The law was so that Israel could prosper in the promised land that God gave them. But Jesus has come proclaiming the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven is much grander than the borders of Israel. The kingdom of heaven is a cosmic kingdom. The kingdom of heaven has no borders, and it encompasses this entire world. But more so, the kingdom of heaven is a place where God dwells again with his people. And in that regard, there is an aspect of this that is already and not yet. Part of Jesus' message has been repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Meaning that the kingdom of heaven is presently on earth right now. And whenever we believe in Jesus, God's Spirit is dwelling in us because we are now the people who can dwell with God. But there's the aspect that the kingdom of heaven hasn't yet come in full is the reality that at one day Jesus will return and he will redeem this planet. He will make it new, and we will dwell bodily with God fully in his presence. And that's when the kingdom of heaven will come as a whole. And that aspect of it hasn't yet fully come. But in some ways, the kingdom of heaven is already at hand. And this is really good and helpful for us to think about. And I want to make a quick distinction for us between the difference between the kingdom and the church. I think in times we use the term church to be referring about God's people, and we distinguish the difference between local church and universal church to talk about all of God's people. My only problem with making that distinction is that 19 out of 20 times that the word church is used is that it's used to refer to a local gathering of people. And very rarely is it talking about the universal people of God. And but that's exactly what our kingdom language is doing. The kingdom language is the language for God's universal people. And so we at Wilson FBC are wholly a church. We are an autonomous group of people who gather under our shared beliefs physically here in Wilson. We are physically a church who gathers. The Grace Bible Church is a holy and independent church who gathers in Newfane. But we're all people, we are all both churches that are a part of the kingdom of heaven. A pastor I like describes local churches as embassies of the kingdom of heaven. We are people everywhere where churches are meeting throughout the planet that we live on. You will find people who are living out the kingdom of heaven presently and awaiting the fullness of the kingdom of heaven to come. And so in that sense, we are, as a church, living out the kingdom of heaven as we presently dwell with God's Spirit, awaiting for the fullness of the kingdom to come. And this is where our passage this morning starts to come into play, because you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And if the kingdom of heaven is already at hand, but it hasn't yet come in fullness, then how are we to be living presently? Jesus, it's remarkable here. He gives us a rather simple answer to what I imagine is kind of a complex question. I want to know all the outworkings of exactly what should I be doing presently to await this future kingdom. And Jesus just says, be salt and be light. And then he kind of moves on. And that seems surprising to me. And I think there's a kind of a dilemma in my heart of like, how do I wrestle with that? How do I embody God's law right now in a world that is not fully a part of God's kingdom? And the focus of our passage this morning is about how we live really matters. This passage is not about how wicked the world is and how much it needs a Christian influence on it. This passage is about God's people examining themselves and to seeing how they can be salt and light. How are we doing the work that God has set out for us? How can we be living and focus on ourselves to really make sure we're doing what God has always intended for his people to be? And so he's making us wrestle with, are we really doing what salt should do? Are we really doing what light should do? So let's see how that plays out with each of these two images. And let's first look at the image of salt. Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. Now, some people, when we get to this passage, that's all they really read and talk about. And they begin to just think about how are Christians like salt in many ways, how do they impact this world? But I think very few of us tend to really want to keep wrestling with what Jesus says after that. He says, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. The concern for Jesus seems to be about the salt diminishing. Jesus wants us to first and foremost make sure that we as his followers are not losing our saltiness. Russ isn't here to say that doesn't mean we can continue being grumpy, but we don't want to be losing our saltiness as Christians. But if we do, then the result is that we're basically worthless. The only thing that we are good for is to be tossed out and to be trampled by those who walk by. That's how bad it is to be salt that has no saltiness to it. Do you see here that the Christian life is one of holiness and perseverance? Jesus desires for us as his people to prosper in his kingdom, and the way we do that presently is to live out his law, to embody his character. This is not to gain entrance into the kingdom, but it is to flourish within the kingdom. God has made you holy, and you need to continue to be living holy. We've seen it time and time again over the past few years. Locally and globally, Christians have lost their saltiness. They have failed to persevere in this life, and the ministry that they have done is just become worthless. People publicly who come to my mind are just Mark Driscoll, Bill Hybels, Jerry Falwell Jr., Ravi Zacharias, James McDonald. All of these men have had major scandals in the past few years and have made a shipwreck of their faith and their ministries. All of these men at some point wanted to make an impact for Jesus in this world, but because of sin and wickedness in this world, they were turned away from God's righteousness. Now it doesn't matter how much good they did, because their terrible lives have led them to a place where they are like salt that is no longer has its saltiness. So the only purpose is to throw it out, because it's not good for us anymore. So do you see that your life and your character really matters? What you do matters, because if you don't persevere in this life, if you don't continue to embody the ways of the Lord, then you will be salt that is no longer saltiness. And I want to be clear, and I want to give some comfort to some of us as well in this passage. The Christians who lose their saltiness here is not just the basic Christian who is always tempted to sin because we are still in the flesh and we're always wrestling with the sin in this life and we're waiting for redemption in the fullness to come. The Christian who is salt and loses its saltiness is the Christian who is proclaiming Jesus with their lips, yet they are continuing to rebel against God, and they know what they're doing, and they continue that pattern of rebellion. They're just choosing to continue living however they want. They indulge in whatever their heart desires are, and they feel no guilt about it. They continue to use the powers of this world to build themselves up, and they are just not embodying the ways of the Lord. They are not doing what salt should do. And so for us who struggle with sin and are fighting it constantly in our lives, this should make us feel uncomfortable. It should make us hate our sin and want to turn away from it. But just because you sin doesn't mean that you are going to be this salt that has lost its salt. I don't want to cause an identity crisis for you as a Christian by talking about this, but I do want the reality that salt can lose its saltiness to be something that draws you back to the holiness of God. But here's another part of the good news for us this morning. You are the salt of the earth. Christians, you do not need to do anything to be the salt of the earth. Your mere existence is how the land remains salty. Just by following Jesus and embodying the ways of the Lord, you are doing what salt is supposed to do. If you live as the Sermon on the Mount is teaching us, you will be prospering in the kingdom of heaven, and we will be doing what salt should do. So I want you to hear this morning, that I don't think we should be afraid of the direction our world is heading right now. I know many of you specifically worry about our country and that is drifting away from Christian values. And I want you to hear this morning. I want you to be encouraged. If you are following Jesus, if there are communities of believers who are gathering, if people are striving to embody the ways of the Lord, then you have nothing to fear. The church is doing exactly what God has intended for it to do. It will remain the salt of the earth. But if that's not even enough for you, I want to remind you that if Jesus rose from the grave, if Jesus did what he said he was going to do, and he is alive presently, be reminded that everything is going to be okay. Jesus is going to make things right. So that's the image of salt and what it has to say for us this morning. Let's look at the second image in this passage and see how the image of light can inform us also about how we embody God's law. So it's in verse 14, it says, "You are the light of the world." There's a little bit of a distinction being made, not just between salt and light, but in scope. There's a difference between earth and world here. And it's kind of hard for us to notice that in English because the term earth and world mean the same thing to us. It's the planet that we live on. But the word earth is also translated as land in some places. And so the land is referred to as more just smaller locations. So we've seen the land of Judah, the land of Jerusalem. It's often referring to a city or a country. And so its scope isn't as large. But the world here, in Matthew at least, is referring to the whole globe that we live on. It has a universal aspect to it. It's a little bit grander. But also, don't confuse that with how John uses the word world to refer to the things that oppose God. So it's helpful to keep those distinctions and pay attention to how certain authors use certain words. And the scope of the image here, it's much grander, and the metaphor is also much more clear to us, too. Salt, you feel like you can take that in 100 different directions, and no one knows if they're right with it or not. But light makes much more sense to us. And the idea of light has already been discussed in Matthew's gospel. It was referred to about Jesus at the end of chapter 4. Jesus was referred to as the great light in reference to his actions in Galilee. So one implication for us to be the salt to be the light of the world is that we are doing what our master is also doing. We are following in his footsteps. He is our example, and we are following his example. He is our teacher, and we are his students. And Jesus is going on to teach us about the light by giving us two examples in this passage. And both of these examples are just stating the obvious, basically. The two examples are the city on the hill and the light on the lamp on the lampstand. So let's look at verse 14, the second half of it. "A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." So it should be clear here that you being the light of the world, a city on a hill are not the same two things. He's not saying that we as the light of the world are the city on the hill. He's using that as a metaphor to explain what does it mean to be the light of the world. And a city on a hill is simply that. It's a city that is high up, that has lights on, and that from far away you see it. It's impossible for that city to be hidden because it's above everything else and there's nothing obstructing it. You can see it from a great distance away. And so it's just obvious that a city on the hill, it's going to be impossible to miss. That's just obviously what light does. And the second image that he gives us is, "Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket." It's absurd. You don't get a lamp and then put it underneath something where it can't do what it's supposed to do. For us, that would be like saying you don't get a light fixture in here and then put it underneath your couch, because it's absurd. It wouldn't do anything. You get a light and you put it on the roof where it should go so it can illuminate the whole room. And so he says, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. The lamp does what it should do, obviously. You put it on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who need it. And Jesus uses this to really just show us that light does what light does, and it helps people see clearly. Which leads to what Jesus has to teach us in verse 16. "In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." What I thought was really interesting about verse 16 is that your light shining before others is about doing good works. That really caught me off guard this week as I read that, because when I think of being light to others, I think of kind of like what John the Baptist says in John chapter 1. I'm not the light. I just testify about the light. But here, Matthew and Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is showing us that you are the light if you are embodying God's ways and doing good works. And it makes sense if we keep this Sermon on the Mount in context about rightly understanding God's law and living out God's law. Being light is being like Jesus because we also are embodying God's ways in his law. And we are doing good works just like Jesus did good works. So the way you serve, the way you care for the needy, the way that you meet the needs of others around you shows the world who we are. And the light is going to do obviously what the light does. It is going to illuminate things so people can see. So when you serve, when you do good works in this world, it is helping people see what is good. It is helping people see who God is and what he desires in this world because you're doing what God wants his people to be doing. So if you do good works, others will see clearly the ways of the Lord. And this is for the purpose of people glorifying your Father in heaven. He says, so that they may see your good works. So that's one purpose, is you do good works so that people can see your good works. And the purpose is to give glory to your Father who is in heaven. When you do good works, people are seeing that, and they're seeing who God is through you. We want people all around us to be glorifying the Father. So we should go and be light and to do good works. We should embody God's law to care for people around us. That's how we prosper in the kingdom of heaven right now. So we want people to be seeing who God is and his ways so that they can glorify him. But I also don't want us to forget about the importance of being salt here too. There's a tension between these two, I think. We must work to make sure that we do not lose our saltiness in our pursuit of doing good works. We don't want to turn away. We want to continue to turn away from wickedness so that we continue doing good works. We don't want our efforts to do good works to lead us to stray away from God's ways. And so I think being the kingdom of heaven, we want to be careful not to diminish God's law, and we want to live in a way where we're not losing our saltiness. And so I think being the kingdom of heaven, to be salt and to be light, I think one of the best ways to do that is to be involved and committed in a local church. Commit yourself to a community of believers. Be involved, be deeply involved in one another's lives. The local church is a way where we keep each other in community with one another so that we don't wander away and drift away from God's ways. We continue to keep people together, and that's how we can persevere and to fight against people turning away from God's ways. We want them to remain holy and to persevere. But we also want the local church to support you as you go out on mission every day in your life, in your work, in the people you are around. We want you to continue being light in this world, and we want you to be doing good works out there. But we also want to be careful that we don't just abandon God and just to keep going and doing whatever we need. So are you serving people? Are you going out of your way to be light? Do you want others to glorify your Father in heaven? Are you being salt and light in this world as a church, in your own life? Because that's important for us, and we need to be paying attention to that. And so the way you live matters. How you act, who you surround yourself with will shape you. And I want you as a church to live as salt and light. And I want you to surround yourself by godly people who will help you persevere in this life. So commit yourself to a local church body. Be a member of a church. Let me pray for us.